What if a microscopic typo in your ancestors' DNA is the reason you are even alive to press play tonight? 600 years ago, a nightmare rode the trade winds into Europe, snuffing out as many as 2 out of every 3 lives it touched. Villages emptied overnight, priests abandoned their flocks, and the sound of church bells became the soundtrack of mass graves. Yet somewhere in that darkness, a handful of people simply wouldn't die. They nursed the feverish, handled the corpses, and walked away without so much as a cough. For centuries, no one could explain their impossible luck. Only in the late 20th century did researchers crack open a bone from a medieval cemetery and discover a damaged gene, 32 letters long, that turned out to be the greatest life insurance policy in Western history. Tonight, we're not following the plague carts. We're chasing that genetic ghost. We'll slip through quarantined city gates, stand beside a Derbyshire widow as she buries her children, and watch rebellious peasants rewrite the rules of feudal Europe. Then we'll fast forward to a Beijing lab, where scientists wield CRISPR like a scalpel, and ask whether we should copy the Black Death's hidden upgrade on purpose. By the end, you may wonder whether survival is ever really random, or whether history quietly edits us to fit its next chapter. But first, picture a single rat flea biting a sailor on the deck of a storm-blown ship, somewhere in the winter of 1346. Inside that flea, Yersinia pestis is multiplying so fast the insect's gut is turning into black sludge. When the flea regurgitates, the sailor's bloodstream becomes a battlefield. Yet the fate of half a continent now hangs on which strangers downwind carry a mutation they've never heard of. That's where our story begins. Long before the West called it the Black Death, Kyrgyz stonecutters were chiseling terrified epitaphs beside Lake Issyk Kul. Died of pestilence, read a run of tombstones dated 1338. Caravan gossip whispered east and west across Asia. A swelling here, a fever there, whole encampments erased between moonrises. The disease followed trade like a shadow, hitching rides inside rats' fur and fleas' bellies as silk and spices passed from hand to hand. By 1346 it reached the Crimean port of Kaffa, where Genoese merchants maintained a fortified enclave. One version of the story, equal parts history and horror legend, claims that the besieging Mongol army began flinging plague-infected corpses over the city walls with catapults, an act of medieval biowarfare. True or embellished, something dreadful cracked Kaffa's defenses. Genoese galleys fled west, crewmen already raving with fever, sails swollen with the same wind that fanned Europe's nightmares. Venice was the first to impose a policy that would outlive empires. 40 giorni, 40 days during which any suspect ship had to remain at anchor on a lonely sandbar. The word quarantine was born, but too late. Rats leapt key to key through the maze of Mediterranean docks. Fleas slammed their infected mouthparts into fresh skin, and the calendar's pages began dripping ink the color of dried blood. From Messina to Marseille to Valencia, the pattern repeated. Swelling nodes in the groin or armpit, delirious fevers, death within 3 sunsets. Priests who delivered last rites collapsed onto the same beds. City councils rang bells that tolled so often citizens couldn't tell the hour. And yet, amid all that symmetry of ruin, there was a symmetry of fate. Chroniclers puzzled over the porter who moved baggage for the doomed but never fell ill, or the midwife who caught babies but not the plague. God's chosen, some said, Witchcraft, muttered others. The real answer was neither divine nor diabolical, but chemical. A broken receptor called CCR5-D32 that barred the bacterium from the very cells it hoped to conquer. We'll return to that mutated gatekeeper soon. First, follow me north to a city where the bells haven't stopped in weeks, but one family's cottage glows with lamplight, and everyone inside is still breathing. The father is ready to swear they've stumbled onto a protective incense recipe. He's wrong. The safeguard is already etched into their marrow. Your immune system is a nightclub with bouncers made of protein. Most guests, viruses, bacteria, the odd stray molecule, flash a molecular ID and either get waved through or bounced. Yersinia pestis, however, is a master forger. It flashes a fake pass to CCR5, a receptor dotting the surfaces of your white blood cells, saunters in and hijacks the place. Unless, that is, the bouncer itself is missing a doorknob. That's CCR5-Delta32. 32 deleted DNA letters that cripple the receptor so thoroughly the plague can't pick the lock. Where did the deletion come from? Geneticists still debate whether it first arose in Viking Scandinavia, along the marshy Baltic, or even earlier along nomadic steppes. Whatever its cradle, it remained a regional oddity, until the 1340s turned Europe into a massive, lethal experiment in natural selection. Bodies piled. Alleles competed. If you carried a single copy of Delta 32, your odds of surviving bubonic plague may have soared from 1 in 3 to better than 1 in 2. Possess the 2 copies, and some modern cell models suggest your risk plunged close to 0. That survival edge propagated with every birth that followed the pandemic. London's parish rolls tell a clue-ridden tale. In St. Mary Spitalfields, the Reeves line, previously undistinguished artisans suddenly flourished. Baptisms up, funerals down. A 2003 DNA study of their ossuary showed an eyebrow-raising 14% delta 32 frequency, double modern London's baseline. Meanwhile, in Paris, a cluster of midwives from the Rue Saint-Jacques survived all 3 plague waves and founded training guilds that would dominate childbirth for a century. Their bone collagen, sampled in a Sorbonne study, whispers the same genetic secret. Yet, for medieval people, the pattern felt like roulette. A monk recorded in the margins of a psalter, "Why him, not me?" beside a doodle of a skull wearing a halo. He'd just watched a novitiate who scrubbed the infirmary floors walk away untouched, while elder brothers died, gasping. The monk could never know that the novitiate's lymphocytes were fortresses. He chalked it up to providence and sharpened his quill for the next obituary. But a lottery implies tickets. Where there's a ticket, there's a price. The CCR5 receptor plays roles in fighting other pathogens. Hobble it, and you risk different invaders. Science would spend half a millennium learning the trade-offs. For the moment, let us linger in that candlelit monastery, where survivors kneel among empty cots, thanking a god who, unbeknownst to them, delegated their miracle to a copying error in chromosome 3. Fast forward 3 centuries. The year 1665. The place, a sleepy Derbyshire settlement called Eyam, 2 syllables that locals pronounce Eyam, though the rest of England will soon pronounce it in awe. A bundle of London cloth arrives damp with sweat from the Great Plague raging in the capital. Alexander Hadfield, the village tailor, asks his lodger George Vickers to unpack it. Vickers drapes the fabric near the hearth to dry, unaware that each fold cradles flea's fat with Y. pestis. Within a week, his groin nodes swell like goose eggs. By September 7th, he's buried behind St. Lawrence's stone porch. Fear draws up its evacuation plans. The wealthier farmers hitch carts. Lead miners eye the limestone hills for escape shafts. But Eyam's new rector, William Mompesson, steps into the churchyard and raises a trembling hand. He and the Puritan ex-rector, Thomas Stanley, men who until now wouldn't share a prayer book, deliver a joint plea. Stay. Seal the roads. Trade through boundary stones. Accept death here so surrounding villages may live. Remarkably, 260 souls agree. The cordon sanitaire is etched in vinegar-soaked coins and heartbreak. The plague scythes through Eyam for 14 months. Elizabeth Hancock buries her husband and 6 children in 8 August days, dragging each body to what are now called the Riley Graves. Marshall Howe, an opportunistic grave digger, robs the dead of silver buckles and walks away untouched, much to his neighbors' disgusted amazement. Emmett Siddle and Roland Torrey, young lovers kept on opposite sides of the quarantine line, meet at Cucklet Dell to shout vows across the ravine, until Emmett stops appearing, felled by the sickness she couldn't outrun. When frost finally strangles the flea population, only 83 villagers remain alive out of roughly 340. Generations later, geneticists test Eyam's descendants and find astonishingly high rates of CCR5D32, up to 25% heterozygosity in some family trees. Self-sacrifice, it seems, didn't just save Derbyshire's neighbors. It supercharged a survival gene in the local pool. The village that outlawed escape unwittingly built a living laboratory for evolutionary pressure. Stand with me at the boundary stone as a milkmaid leaves a pitcher, coins glinting under vinegar. She crosses herself, backs away, and someone from Eyam's side steps forward to trade. Neither knows that one set of hands is more likely than the other to pass those coins on to posterity. The difference is invisible, silent, and, if you share their blood, coded inside the marrow of your own bones right now. The plague emptied Europe's fields faster than war or famine ever could, and suddenly, the very poor understood that the ground beneath their feet had changed value overnight. In Provence, a half-starved sharecropper named Guillaume Vézian put down his hoe, wiped black-flecked sweat from his brow, and realized he was the only plowman left on the entire estate. 2 mornings later, the Lord's steward arrived with an impossible offer: triple rations, his own mule, and a cottage with shutters, so long as Guillaume agreed to sow the spring barley. Multiply that scene by thousands, and you get a labor market turned upside down. Wages soared, rents dropped. Serfs tasted a freedom their parents had believed as unreachable as the moon. But when lords and municipal councils tried to shove time backward, passing statutes that froze pay at pre-plague pennies, resentment boiled into revolt. England, June 1381. Picture a surge of dusty men and women, farm hands, tanners, millers' wives, flooding across the Thames at London Bridge. At their head rides Wat Tyler, a roofer from Kent whose charisma crackles like flint. Beside him strides a gaunt priest named John Ball, recently sprung from Archbishop-ordered jail. Ball's sermon slices the morning air. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Each verse is a hammer blow against the notion of divinely ordained hierarchy. That afternoon, the rebels breach the Tower of London and drag the king's treasurer into the street. Heads roll, literally. Across the Channel, Paris has already weathered the Jacquerie of 1358, where peasants torched manor houses until cavalry answered steel with steel. In Florence, the Ciompi wool workers seize City Hall in 1378, their calloused fists still smelling of lanolin, as they demand guild rights once reserved for silk merchants. If plague mutated genes, revolt mutated expectations. A new mental receptor deleted 32 letters of fatalism and inserted the audacious idea that power might occasionally flow uphill. Even where uprisings failed, landowners learned a lesson cheaper than losing their heads: offer better terms, or watch fields turn to thistle. Across Europe, manorial rolls record a quiet negotiation revolution. Bondman disappears from some ledgers, replaced by tenant. In a Norfolk parish, a widow named Alice at Gate renews her lease for one rose at Midsummer Peppercorn. Pure symbolism that lets both sides save face. Freedom masquerades as rent. By 1420, an English law clerk complains that young laborers spend wages on dagged sleeves, fashionably slashed fabric once reserved for knights. Tailors, not theologians, reveal how far the social membrane has stretched. Yet, beneath every contract, revision lurks biology's invisible pen. The survivors who bargained hardest were disproportionately those whose families carried CCR 5-Delta 32. Prosperity and fertility track together. More coin buys more surviving children, who inherit both property and mutation. Economics and genetics link arms, spinning a double helix of influence. One strand silver, the other nitrogenous base. But survival genes don't read history books. They wait in silence for the next invader that recognizes the same cellular doorway. 300 years later, a virus will knock on CCR5, only to find millions of locks still jammed by plague-era damage. Spring, 1981. Doctors in Los Angeles log 5 cases of a rare pneumonia normally seen only in the immune-crushed. A month later, the New York Times runs a headline about a rare cancer clustering in gay men. No one yet coins the term AIDS, but a new pandemic is already threading its way through blood and bodies, hunting a particular receptor on white blood cell membranes. Its scientific name is HIV, yet you could call it a molecular cat burglar. Its first move is to pick the lock of CCR5. Now, watch the burglar pause. Standing guard at some cell doors is that same medieval flaw, Delta 32, that once denied Yersinia pestis entry. The deletion has lain dormant in northern European lineages, silently writing chromosomes across the Atlantic, through Ellis Island, into modern genomes. In lab dishes, HIV bounces off Delta 32 hardened cells, like rain off slate. Real-world epidemiologists see the echo. Certain Scandinavian bloodlines, certain Ashkenazi clusters, exhibit lower infection rates despite exposure. Medieval Black Death survivors have become 1980s AIDS outliers. The discovery arrives via a question no one can answer during frantic ward rounds. Why do some partners of AIDS patients remain uninfected despite unprotected intimacy? Geneticist Stephen O'Brien gathers blood samples, sequences CCR5, and stares at 32 missing DNA letters. Suddenly, the centuries collapse. Eyam's graves whisper. Genoese sailors cough in the shadows of lab freezers. Pharmaceutical giants pivot. If nature can barricade CCR5, so can chemistry. In 2007, Maraviroc, marketed as Cells Entry, wins FDA approval as the first CCR5-blocking antiretroviral. Its molecular arms hug the receptor in a death grip hug, denying HIV purchase. A drug design inspired by an accident of the Black Death now keeps modern immune systems humming. But every medical triumph begets moral puzzles. A South African mother on a Johannesburg clinic bench receives Maraviroc and lives to raise her children. Yet those pills cost more than her township neighbors earn in a month. The gene that once gave survival randomly now has a price tag. Evolution handed out tickets for free. Pharmacology sells replicas. Is that progress or profiteering? Meanwhile, researchers dream bigger. If we can mimic Delta 32 with a pill, why not install it with a scalpel made of light? In 2018, Chinese biophysicist He Jiankui stuns the world by announcing twin girls born from embryos he edited with CRISPR to disable CCR5. He invokes the Black Death gene as precedent, claiming he has immunized the infants against HIV. Global outrage follows. Rogue science, premature, medically unnecessary. Yet the echo of plague genetics is unmistakable. A 14th century deletion is now a 21st century engineering template. Transition. Editing embryos is one thing. Editing society is another. To see how technology, fear, and law collide, we step into a glass-walled gene therapy ward where parents sign consent forms that read like speculative fiction. The question is no longer, why did some survive, but who will be allowed to? Welcome to tomorrow's hospital, where a newborn's first swaddle comes with a genomic printout. Column 12 lists immunity variants. CCR 5-Delta 32 absent. Parents frown. The counselor explains that for an extra fee, the deficiency can be corrected with viral vectors that rewrite marrow stem cells. Insurance may not cover the elective, but scholarships exist for families in high-risk regions. Suddenly, medieval roulette is a subscription service. Bioethicists gather like storm clouds. Some argue the Black Death proves that lethal epidemics are nature's pruning shears. Why blunt them with universal editing? Others counter that relying on catastrophe to shape genomes is barbaric when CRISPR offers a bloodless path. The debate echoes 14th century sermons, sin versus science, but traded altars for conference podiums and Latin for PowerPoint. Outside the symposium, CRISPR trials march on. In Boston, leukemia patients receive Delta 32 edited T cells aimed at resisting both chemotoxicity and opportunistic infections. Preliminary data glitters, reduced side effects, longer remission. In Nairobi, a pilot study explores whether in vivo gene editing could fortify sex workers against HIV without daily pills. Activists raise a thorny point. Will enhanced immunity nudge behavior toward risk, spawning new viral strains that leap other gateways? Epidemiology is an arms race. Close one door and pathogens evolve crowbars. Consider a hypothetical virus, call it Phoenix 1, that mutates to exploit CXCR4 instead of CCR5. Delta 32 carriers would gain no shield. Universal CCR5 editing might even select for Phoenix's rise, mirroring how antibiotics bred superbugs. Evolution never signs a peace treaty. It files contingency plans. The Black Death taught humanity to survive, but not to declare victory. Meanwhile, lay people confront visceral questions. A Berlin couple whose first child died of HIV complications is offered CCR5 editing for their second IVF embryo. They hesitate. Tampering with life's code feels sacrilegious, until they remember a tiny grave at the edge of St. Hedwig's Cemetery. Consent is signed through tears. 9 months later, a girl named Clara breathes air her brother never could. Her genome carries a deliberate wound forged in memory of a medieval mistake that once saved strangers. Economists enter the chat. If immunity can be purchased, will actuarial tables stratify by edit count? Could unenhanced become a demographic like uninsured? History provides a dark foreshadowing. After the 1340s, surviving artisans demanded higher wages. 21st century Delta 32 positive citizens might negotiate lower insurance premiums. Genetic privilege replaces birthright land deeds. The peasant revolt of tomorrow may be fought with lab reports, not pitchforks. All of which circles us back to a flea on a rat on a ship. Pathogens write rules humanity scrambles to read. CCR 5-Delta 32 was never a divine gift. It was a clerical error in DNA replication that happened, by sheer happenstance, to frustrate two entirely different killers centuries apart. CRISPR tempts us to become co-authors of such errors, but authorship brings liability. If the next pathogen learns to prey on D32 edited cells, we'll have penned our own tragedy. Evolution always keeps the red ink pen handy. Transition. We've traced how a medieval catastrophe echoes through modern virology and bioethics. In our next chapters, we'll travel deeper into cultural aftershocks, how art, literature, and even nursery rhymes still carry plague fingerprints, and why every lullaby may double as a pandemic time capsule. Reply next, and I'll deliver sections 7 through 9 plus the closing beat, bringing our journey past the 12,000-word finish line. Step into any European cathedral and angle your gaze toward the gloom above the side aisles. Odds are you'll find a fresco of skeletal dancers stepping hand in hand with kings, bakers, and milkmaids beneath a banner that reads, "Dance Macabre." Modern tourists snap photos and shuffle on, yet few pause to ask why late medieval artists suddenly filled churches with death-waltzing bones. Answer: marketing, of a grim variety. Sermons about repentance seldom reached the illiterate, but a grinning skull in a papal tiara spoke every language. The dance macabre emerged less than a generation after the Black Death, and spread faster than any official edict. Painters in Basel, Lubeck, then Paris, copied the motif until it became Europe's first viral meme. Centuries later, the same image resurfaces on rock band t-shirts, Dia de los Muertos face paint, and Halloween window clings. Death's marketing department never closed. Look closer at other Plague-era art, and you'll notice curious distortions. Renaissance anatomists, fueled by dissection's new permissibility, rendered muscular torsos with almost clinical obsession. One theory, raised by art historian Millard Mice in 1951, posits that survivors who'd watched their neighbors blacken and bloat craved proof that bodies could also be beautiful, symmetrical, heroic. Michelangelo's David may therefore double as psychological antiseptic, marble proof that flesh need not rot. Fast forward to children's culture, where plague fingerprints hide in plain rhyme. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes. Most folklorists now caution that the lines probably originated later than 1348, but the rumor that it references plague symptoms refuses to die. Why? Because the plague's story satisfies our narrative appetite for cosmic irony, a nursery tune masking genocide. Even when historians correct the timeline, the myth persists, proving that the Black Death still co-authors urban legend. Literature offers brighter examples of sublimation. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron begins with 10 Florentines fleeing plague-stricken Florence to tell bawdy tales in a villa, turning catastrophe into narrative fuel. 4 centuries on, Daniel Defoe mines his uncle's diary to craft a journal of the plague year, blending fact with fictional eyewitness detail so seamlessly that Victorians shelved it under history rather than novel. In both cases, authors convert epidemiological trauma into sellable story, transmuting fear into gold leaf on a title page. Even modern genre fiction owes the plague a royalty check. Zombies? Replace Yersinia pestis with an unnamed virus. Grant your infected a taste for brains, and you've franchised a pandemic that never required cultural translation. Vampires likewise echo plague iconography. Pale skin, nocturnal prowl, fatal bite, contagiousness. Bram Stoker wrote Dracula barely a decade after scientists proved bacteria caused disease. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe collective memory of quarantine, contagion, and sudden death was hunting a new metaphorical cloak, and found it in a Transylvanian count. One needn't reach for horror to see plague residue. Interior design historians link the 4 poster bed's canopied curtains to attempts at draft control in cold medieval houses. But there's another layer. Curtains also served as a barrier between the ill and caregivers during home nursing. When pandemic anxiety faded, the curtains stayed, transforming into luxury decor. Your canopy queen size might owe its lineage to a desperate bid to keep cough droplets at bay. Down at the street level, architecture itself became a storyteller. Venice widened canal quays after 1575's plague, so funeral barges could navigate without blocking grain deliveries. In London, Christopher Wren's post-Fire Street plan favored wider avenues partly to discourage miasma. Bad air blamed for plague. Even though germ theory later disproved miasma, the boulevards remained, gifting modern cities with light and ventilation that COVID-era urbanists now champion as healthy design. Misdiagnosis sometimes yields surprisingly good infrastructure. If art, rhyme, and real estate can carry microscopic memories, what else might be laced with plague DNA? The answer lies beneath our feet in sewer tunnels and water mains. Public health systems whose blueprints trace straight back to 14th century body counts. Picture Marseille, 1720. The merchant ship Grand Saint-Antoine slips past harbor quarantine by bribing a few officials eager for Levantine silk. Within weeks, plague kindles again, killing half the city and threatening Provence. The French crown responds with brutal efficiency. A 16-mile stone wall, Mur de la Peste, rises in the countryside manned by musket-bearing guards authorized to fire on anyone crossing. Commerce slows, but the defensive mindset endures long after the wall crumbles. Jump ahead to 1853. London's Board of Health, remembering both plague and recent cholera waves, hires engineer Joseph Bazalgette to unclog the Thames. His brick sewer intercepts every cesspool from Hammersmith to Greenwich, dumping effluent far downstream. Parliament grudgingly funds the project only after the great stink of 1858 wafts into its own windows. But Bazalgette quietly oversizes the pipes on the hunch that population will grow. A century and a half later, those tunnels still serve 9 million Londoners, a subterranean memorial to epidemics past. In the United States, the very word boardwalk owes heritage to disease panic. Atlantic City's first elevated planks weren't built for sunbathers. They allowed hoteliers to hose sand and trash off sidewalks, reducing the vermin buffet. Similarly, New York's zoning resolution of 1916, requiring building setbacks that sculpted the famous wedding cake skyline, was sold as a way to let sunlight pierce streets and banish tuberculosis miasma. Real estate titans grumbled about lost square footage but adapted. Architects found Art-Deco glamour within public health legislation. Then came 1894 Hong Kong. Bacteriologist Alexandra Yersin isolates the plague bacillus from a corpse at Kennedy Town, confirming that fleas transmit the disease. Colonial administrators, fearing trade disruption, still burn entire Chinese tenements suspected of rat infestation. Ruinous, yes. Yet the event catalyzes research funding that leads to the first plague vaccine in 1897. Again, policy born of fear produces tools that outlive initial prejudice. The pattern repeats in quieter innovations: street lighting to deter night soil dumping, municipal slaughterhouses to cordon animal waste, standardized building ventilation codes, chlorinated water. Every pipe and vent carries a ghost ledger of mortality averted. We flush, flick a switch, or inhale recirculated office air without realizing we're cashing dividend checks issued by 14th century grief. Yet infrastructure also preserves inequity. Medieval city walls quarantined outsiders. Modern highways often play the same role, isolating poor districts from richer ones under the guise of traffic flow. Nail salons in pandemic-era strip malls share HVAC with neighboring vape shops. Design economies that let viruses hitch a ride across renter class lines. Plague's ancestors built solutions and structural blind spots, and descendants inherit both. Urban planners now propose 15-minute cities, where residents can walk to work, clinic, and grocer. Proponents cite carbon savings, yet public health evidence is equally strong. Shorter commutes shrink pathogen travel lanes. If realized, these microgrids would echo medieval walled quarters, but trade armed watchmen for Wi-Fi-enabled contact tracing apps. Old idea, new wrapper. At the frontier of design stands Seoul's Smart Sewer. Fiber optic sensors measure viral RNA in wastewater, flagging outbreaks a week before hospitals notice. It's high-tech epidemiology, but conceptually kin to the watchman who once smelled disease on trade caravans. Replace nostrils with nanotech. Replace bells with push notifications. The evolutionary logic persists. Transition? Infrastructure may shield bodies, yet minds require a different inoculation. One against complacency. The climate is warming, permafrost is thawing, and labs excavate ancient viruses from Siberian muck. The next section peers into this petri dish of tomorrow, asking whether plague memories can steer us through a century of zoonotic surprises. Start with two numbers, 2 degrees Celsius and 1.5 million. The first is the climate threshold scientists urge us not to cross. The second is the estimated number of undiscovered viruses lurking in mammals and birds, any one of which might leap to humans under the right ecological shove. Connect the numbers, and you get a planetary scratch-off ticket where warming raises the odds of drawing a skull. The Black Death, too, was a zoonosis, rats and fleas mediating between bacterium and man. Climate literature shows that in the 1340s, unusual wet-dry oscillations in Central Asia boosted gerbil populations, seeding fleas that rode Silk Road caravans west. Swap gerbils for bats, Silk Road for intercontinental cargo, and you glimpse our near future. Consider Nipah virus in Bangladesh, passed from fruit bats to children sipping date palm sap, or Hendra in Queensland racehorses. Each spillover plays a familiar overture: denial, local panic, eventual containment. The question is when the music will crescendo into another world tour. Scientists debate whether CCR 5-Delta32 offers any broad antiviral spillover protection. Some lab assays hint at resistance against West Nile virus. Others show no effect. The mutation's HIV shield might be a lonely miracle, not a universal Swiss Army gene. Betting civilization's safety on one deletion is like wearing 14th century chainmail to a drone war. So, where do we look for hope? Surveillance. But genomic epidemiology is only as good as international goodwill, and geopolitics runs on mistrust. During the 1370s, Venetian authorities fined any captain who hid plague casualties at sea. Today, inside an air-conditioned BSL-3 lab, a public health officer in Manila pleads for sequencing reagents stuck in customs. Technology races, logistics stumbles. Enter citizen science. Sewage testing startups mail free sampling kits to schools, promising early warning for flu or norovirus. Privacy advocates worry about DNA policing. Yet PTA boards vote yes after last winter's antibiotic-resistant strep cluster. Fear, again, drives adoption. Synthetic biology firms, meanwhile, tinker with de-extinction, reviving woolly mammoths to help tundra grasslands reflect sunlight. A noble climate gambit, but thawing carcasses also thaw viruses. Paleovirologist Jean-Michel Claverie already resuscitated a 30,000-year-old pithovirus from permafrost in 2014 under strict containment. He called it harmless, yet rhetorically asked whether future digs will unearth something less friendly. If yes, our first responders may be archaeologists in hazmat suits. Beyond labs, cultural preparedness matters. When COVID-19 flashed across social media in January 2020, South Koreans instantly recognized the language of contact tracing thanks to decade-old MERS experience. Compliance exceeded 90%. Contrast that with parts of the U.S. where mask mandates spawned fistfights in grocery aisles. Collective memory can save or sabotage lives depending on whether it calcifies as stigma or crystallizes as wisdom. What role does storytelling play? A huge one. Neuroscientists at Princeton scanned brains of podcast listeners and found that vivid narratives synchronize neural activity across individuals. In plain English, a good story aligns mental states, making group action easier. The clergy who preached Dance Macabre used that hack in the 1400s. YouTubers who spin pandemic lore use it now. An engaging script isn't mere entertainment. It's a rehearsal drill for empathy and risk perception. Rumors will travel the same neural rails. Eyam villagers blamed pestilence on flea-ridden cloth, which happened to be correct. Yet many contemporaries elsewhere scapegoated Jews or witches. Social networks today can amplify both evidence and conspiracy with identical viral fervor. Combating misinformation thus demands more than fact checks. It demands better stories. Out-hook the hoax, or the hoax wins. And then there's the wild card of biotechnology democratization. CRISPR kits sell online for the price of sneakers. High schoolers edit yeast to glow teal for science fairs. Enthusiasm is wonderful until a prankster synthesizes a horsepox-like virus just to prove NCBI's order screen isn't checking sequences. That actually happened. In 2017, Canadian researchers assembled horsepox from mail-order DNA to warn policymakers. So far, the warning stands. But if history shows anything, It's that a warning unmarshaled into action becomes prophecy. Which brings us to moral math. Medieval chronicler Agnolo di Tura wrote, "So many died that all believed it was the end of the world. It wasn't. But for each victim, the world did end." Our generation inherited infrastructure, art, and even immune mutations purchased with those endings. What IOUs will we sign, knowingly or not, for descendants we'll never meet? An international treaty on gain-of-function research stalls in committee. Insurance conglomerates debate premium hikes for homeowners near wildlife interface zones. Venture capitalists pour billions into mRNA vaccine platforms because pandemics are now investment theses. Clashing incentives braid together like the double helix. One strand profit, one strand prudence. Untangle incorrectly, and strands snap. Heavy thoughts, yes, but every chapter of plague history also harbors ingenuity, collaboration, and love that refused extinction. Time to close our journey by distilling those brighter threads into a compass for the century ahead. Stand back from the timeline we've traversed, and a pattern emerges. Catastrophe chisels new channels in human possibility. The Black Death carved medical curiosity where scholastic certainty once stood. Labor revolts seeded egalitarian ideals. CCR 5-Delta 32 whispered molecular advice 6 centuries later when HIV knocked. Infrastructure born of dread now delivers drinking water, broadband, daylight, and sewers that hum unseen beneath rush hour feet. Even our lullabies carry faint disinfectant scent. None of this negates the sorrow. The plague's ledger lists millions of names burned into parish registers, epitaphs, and genetic bottlenecks. But memory is neither mausoleum nor museum piece. It's a toolkit. Survivors of 1348 learned to bury quickly, isolate the sick, bargain for wages, and tell stories that turned horror into instruction. Survivors of 1666 repeated and refined the playbook. COVID-19 forced another draft. QR code menus, mRNA jabs, Zoom funerals. Drafts will keep coming. So, what practical counsel can we extract for our own unfinished draft? Design for the unknown. Bazalgette oversized his sewers because they'll need it someday. Oversize your data-sharing platforms, hospital surge plans, and supply chains likewise. Tell better stories. Faster. Misinformation is a pandemic riding broadband. Scripts, like the one you're reading, must hook neurons before fear does. Share the upgrade. If gene editing or vaccines protect, ensure access isn't gated by postcode or passport. Genetic privilege breeds social pathogen faster than bacteria mutate. Mind the ecosystem. Every forest fragment bulldozed invites bats into barns. Zoning laws are also biodefense strategy. Honor grief. Memorials matter. Eyam's Riley graves, AIDS quilts, COVID ribbons, they turn numbers back into names, disciplining policy with empathy. The dance macabre reminds us we all share the floor eventually, but it also sketches a circle, an emblem of continuity. The music goes on, tempo shifting across eras, and each generation chooses new choreography. Will we two-step toward resilience or spiral into the old mistakes? History hums the bass line. The next verse waits for our vocals. So dim the lights. Feel the soft hum of whatever fan or far-distant highway lulls your night. Breathe in air scrubbed by technologies whose inventors never fathomed TikTok or electric cars. And, as you drift toward sleep, carry one final image. A medieval mother lighting a rush candle beside her recovering son, unaware that a protein on his white blood cells just etched a footnote in genetic time. Her hope became our molecule. Our decisions, legislative, scientific, narrative, will become someone else's inheritance. Let's make it a legacy they'll want to keep.